What do you need to be satisfied in life, in your own life? I think most of us would answer that question in a whole lot of different ways. I don't think there's a good kind of singular overarching answer that everyone would give, other than maybe basic food and those kinds of things. But I think depending on who you ask, you're going to get a whole host of different questions. And I think it's going to matter depending on probably age. It's going to matter based on economic standing. Right? If you're somebody who's making $200K a year and I ask, what do you need to be happy? You probably have some different ideas than someone who's been living below the poverty line. And so there's all kinds of different ways that you might answer that question. It might not even be a financial question to you. Maybe you would get philosophical about that kind of an answer, and you might talk about the need for purpose and meaning and fulfillment of some kind, to know that you don't just exist as a vapor on this earth, that there's a reason that you're here, right? That might be a need for content and happiness. Maybe you would get anthropological with me and you would talk about how you need to have some kind of interaction in community, right? Like for you to be happy, you need to be amongst people, especially the extroverts among us, right? That might be the route that you go. Maybe it is something that you would go down of material goods, and you would talk about a certain level of lifestyle that you would need to achieve, whether that's the basic needs, right? Some might even be very pragmatic, and they'd said they'd give you an answer like, well, as long as I have a roof over my head and shoes on my feet, I could be happy and find joy in that. The answers would vary very wildly. There's a well-known psychologist named Abraham Maslow, and I've years ago had brought this pyramid up, and I'm bringing it back today. He has this motivational theory in psychology, and there's a pyramid that he's known for called the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Here it is. The idea is that we have a ton of human needs. All of us have things that we need to be happy in life to some degree, right? And that we have those needs really tiered kind of to importance, so to speak, right? At the very top, you have these self-actualization type of things where, you have a need to have purpose in life, to find meaning and those kinds of things. And then, the esteem needs are things like respect and status and recognition. All of us have some level of feeling like we need to be at least recognized as a human to some degree by other people, right? We don't need the applause, but we need to at least be acknowledged as existing to some degree, right? And then you have the relational needs, like things like friendship, intimacy, love, even human connection. And then safety needs like security and health and property. And at the very bottom are what we call physiological needs, the very basic stuff we need to live, like food, air, right? Some semblance of warmth and rest. You need sleep to be able to function, right? No one can work 24 hours straight. They would die. And so we have this period here, and I think the theory was that we seek these needs out in an ascending order. And what I mean by that is we don't seek to meet the higher needs if we are in a situation of life where a lower need isn't met. So if you're on the street starving, you're not worried about, what is my purpose and meaning in life? You're worried about how am I going to eat and live today, right? And it's not until you meet those needs that you start to think about the others and the others. So we kind of have an ascending order from the bottom up with which we seek to meet these kinds of needs, right? Why am I going to talk about Maslow's pyramid of needs? Why are we talking about psychology in a sermon? Because I think it brings us to looking at the second chapter in Ruth, and we have to understand something about Ruth and Naomi's circumstance that is really hard for any of us to feel or understand or comprehend in any kind of real, tangible way. We might get our head around it, but we won't be able to empathize in any way with people that are in their situation. What I mean by this is Ruth and Naomi are living exclusively at the beginning of chapter 2 underneath the very bottom of that pyramid. Right? They are below the provision of having the basic necessities of life met. Right? Some of you in this room might have been hungry at some point, but I'm going to guess that probably, right, I don't want to presume, but probably no one in this room genuinely thought they would starve to death if tomorrow didn't bring food, right? That's a level of need that most of us can't even get our head around, right? Someone begging on the street around us today even, right? I don't want to belittle their circumstance by any means, but even today we live in a country that is so overabundant right? That even the trash table scraps of our abundance provide basic life. Is it a dignified life? No, right? But very few people today in our country starve to death, right? And so if we take this back and we look at Ruth and Naomi in their time, right? The poorest person in our country doesn't hold a candle to the poverty that Ruth and destitution that Ruth and Naomi are experiencing, just because of the level of cultural difference. That as we read, we're going to start to see, right, just how destitute they are. We just can't get our head around it. And we have to understand that that's where they find themselves before we can really understand what is happening here. Ruth and Naomi were poor and destitute in a time where you would regularly find people left for dead on the street, starved to death. The poor would just not have anywhere to go. There were no programs, so to speak. There were no, government assistance for things like food or housing. And so if you think about it, everyone that you ever known or have met that was on that kind of assistance today, chances are they would not be making it in biblical times. Right? There's just a level of destitution. We like to gloss over these things when we encounter them in Scripture, but I think it's really important to just see how rough it is for them, right? How hard things get. And that's where we pick up today in the second chapter of Ruth. And as we read, we're going to begin to see this first tier of redemption. Remember I said there's 3 tiers of redemption in the book of Ruth. The first tier is going to start to kind of emerge as we look in this second of the 4 chapters. And we're going to look at this chapter as we go. And so normally I would have you stand when we read Scripture. I'm not going to have you do that today because we've got like 5 different segments, I think, that we're looking at. And so, again, the level of up-downs, we're not Catholic. So we're going to look at these kind of almost verse by verse in some chunks and try to see and understand what is happening here. And so here's the opening 2 verses of the book of Ruth, chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." And so right off the bat here, there's this mention of this new character that we're introduced to, Boaz. We don't really know who he is yet. Some of you might, but we're not supposed to know who he is yet. And nor is he introduced in a way that Naomi or Ruth would be understanding him to be part of the story. It just opens the chapter with, hey, by the way, there was this guy named Boaz, and he was part of the clan of Elimelech, which was Naomi's husband who had died. And so he's a relative, right? We don't know exactly how he relates, but he's related to them. He's part of their family. And then it says that here's Naomi and Ruth. We found them last, having entered back into Bethlehem, right? Ruth is a foreigner in the land. She doesn't know anybody. And we're not given a whole lot of detail on their circumstance, but we can presume that their circumstance is nothing, right? There's no mention of, well, and then she came back to Naomi's house, right? What's said is, when Ruth finishes in the field that we're going to read about today, you're going to see that she goes back to the city to find Naomi. There's no mention of any home. We could assume that they're homeless, destitute, starving on the street. And that when Ruth ever returns to Naomi, she's coming to a place where she found her on the street that she had been when she left, right? And so we have this opening where Ruth is waking up perhaps for the first day in her new home as a foreigner with not knowing anybody or understanding anything. And she says to Naomi, I think it probably would be a good idea for me to go try to glean in the fields. Right? What does it mean to glean? Well, I lied earlier when I said that back in the day there were no government welfare programs, sort of. Because while there was no government help, right, there was no housing or food kind of allowances for those who were poor and destitute, the Lord did factor in when he established his people, Israel, back in the beginning of the Old Testament in the Torah, he established some laws that affect how Israel's people were to treat the worst, the least of these. The poor, the destitute, the widows, the orphans. right? And one of the ways that God sought to solve at least a portion of their destitution and issues is through these gleaning laws. And here's just two sections where we kind of read a little bit more about what these gleaning laws are. Here's Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to the edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. Okay, the stuff that drops on the ground. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Again, here in Deuteronomy, just a little later. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. And the Lord your God may bless you in all of the work of your hands. And so, as the Lord establishes his people, he creates these laws that are kind of a requirement for the farmer to essentially operate with a purposeful lack of efficiency. Right? This is different from the demand to tithe 1/10 to the temple. This is an idea that when you plow a field, if you have 100 acres, and you kind of should probably end up with maybe an acre of it left at the end, because just don't go to the edge of your field. Right? There's the dirt road. Here's your field. Just kind of leave the last foot of it and don't harvest that foot. Right? Leave a little bit of room. And then even beyond that, if you when you're harvesting stuff, whether it's grain or fruit in whatever fields that you happen to be a farmer in, inevitably stuff will drop to the ground sometimes. You should leave that stuff too. Right? 2 weeks ago when we were on vacation, there was one day it was too cold to go to the beach, and so we went to a blueberry farm with our family, and we were picking blueberries. And for the first couple minutes of it, I had to teach Erin to pick the berries off the plant rather than eating all the blueberries that were on the floor, on the ground as she would walk. She would go and just start picking stuff up. And because once she discovered that there was an essentially unlimited supply of blueberries, that girl just went to town, right? But she'd be like, why don't I reach if I can just right here? So she just sat and started. You have to teach her. No. But that's what the gleaning laws were. It was this idea that you would leave some, you would purposefully not farm to your full efficiency. And if you had a sheaf that you'd established and you kind of forgot it in the field, you weren't allowed to go back and get it. If you got home and were like, oh, I left that, too bad. You leave that. And the idea was that it was for the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow, the poor, the needy. So as they were walking down the road, they could walk up to the edge of the field and they could pick, or they could go through the field after you had plowed it, after you had reaped it, and they could pick up the leftovers, right? Inevitably, you would drop a bunch of stuff. And it was their way of kind of feeding those who were hungry and destitute. Right? How cool of the Lord to have thought of that in a way, right? To have these laws established that even as he brings his people into being, he's already thinking about the poor and the needy and the destitute among them. And he's telling them, be just a little bit bad at your job so that the poor can eat. Right? And so Ruth suggests to Naomi that she should go and try to glean and hopefully find favor of whatever farmer she would glean in. And this phrase of like finding favor tells us a lot. See, while they had these laws, there was a couple issues that are at play that make things less than ideal. Number one, Israelites are notoriously terrible at keeping their laws, right? It's just a known thing. If you look through any law and commandment that the whole idea of the Old Testament is that Israel can't keep its laws. Gleaning laws are no exception. There were farmers that were greedy and selfish, and many of them would not allow gleaning to take place. They would farm to the maximum efficiency. They would be ruthless in how they treated their workers to ensure that they got every last grain and every last dollar out of it. And even if they didn't, there were farmers that if you were to enter onto their field, they'd chase you off, right? This is private property. Beyond that, you think about a field and the scope of it. It's out in the middle of nowhere, and there's all these workers. We later on hear Naomi talk to Ruth about avoiding potential abuse. And one of the things we learn if we read about that time and other sources is that there certainly were levels of abuse that would take place. If you were a young woman gleaning by yourself in a field during that time, you were among a bunch of workers that were men and young, and maybe you were attractive, and chances are your shot of abuse in the field was pretty high. And so gleaning was actually a pretty dangerous activity on top of being a grueling one, right? It's really, in some ways, it's better than being a beggar, because there's a sense to which you work for what you have, and there's some dignity that comes along with that. But in every other way, it's worse than being a beggar, because it requires intense amount of labor and hardship, and the potential for suffering and struggle or abuse is just really, really high. And so this is not a job that any of you want to do. I would rather clean septic tanks and toilets all day than to go glean in a field in Israel, in Bethlehem, during this time. And on top of that, if you remember, this whole book takes place during the time when the judges ruled, when everything was chaos. Everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes, right? It was a moral free-for-all. And so what Ruth is suggesting she does here is probably one of the more, if not most dangerous activities that you can imagine during this time. And yet she says to Naomi, I think I should go, and I just would hope that whatever field I end up in, I don't know anybody, but wherever I go, that I would find favor in the eyes of that person. In other words, that I might be able to actually get some food without walking away abused or even worse, dead. And Naomi's response is, go, my daughter. Super caring, that Naomi, right? You can imagine that Naomi, we know at the end of chapter 1, she's very destitute. She's downtrodden. She probably, today we would probably say she's dealing with severe, significant, debilitating depression. Naomi is in a bad place, right? She literally changes her name to bitter and asks people to call her that, right? And so she probably isn't even at a functional level. Because the question that I have when I read this is, well, there's two women that are destitute. The one was loyal and came with you. She's about to say, I'm going to go find us food so that we don't starve to death. You think she could maybe have gone along? Right? Like, we don't know her age or those kinds of things. Maybe she was able to, maybe she wasn't. But you get more done with two, or at least you have company. Naomi just says, go, my daughter. Right? She just sends her. Continue on in verse 3. And so she set out and went. And she gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. And then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. And so she came, and she has continued from early morning all the way till now, except for a short rest. So we learn that she ends up in the field that belongs to Boaz, right? And he's part of the family of Elimelech, a.k.a. Naomi. We all know that as the reader. She doesn't know any of that. And Boaz just so happens to be in his own field as the owner of the field. It's not usual, but he comes in from the city, and he's perhaps checking on the workers, and he goes to those that are his servants, and bless you, and they greet each other. And as he's talking to his servants, how's it going in the field? Are we doing what we need to do? Do you need anything? I don't know what they're talking about. He catches the eye of, there's Ruth over there. And he sees her, and he doesn't recognize her, and he said, hey, who's that woman in my field? And the servant answers, number one, she's Ruth, the Moabite woman, which had been the talk of the town, so he kind of then knows who she is. But he goes above and beyond just answering the question, and he gives two more bits of really important information. Number one, well, she asked to glean this morning in the field. Like, she came up to us and asked if it was okay that she gleaned. And number two, she's been working since early morning and only taking a very, very brief rest, right? And so there's two things we learn here. Ruth is very kind. She's very humble, right? Gleaning was something that was kind of assumed in a way. So like, you didn't ask to glean a field. Usually you did it when the owner wasn't even around. You just kind of knew that you would see the leftover foot on the side of the road, or the fact that the harvest had been completed, and you'd go into the field and you'd do your thing, and you'd try to be kind of unseen, tucked away, so to speak, right? But no, not Ruth. She goes up and she asks if it's okay, right? She's humble enough not to just assume that it's her right to be there, but she requests to be there. And then the other is that she's incredibly hard-working, right? This picture that's painted of Ruth is one of politeness and of hard, committed work. She's not lazy or entitled. She easily could have been jaded and marred by her circumstance. Remember, destitute, bottom below the pyramid, right? She has no reason to have any kind of politeness left in her life. But she doesn't let the circumstances that she's in dictate the character that she possesses, right? Don't we do that a lot? I think it's so impressive because she does what she does under the absolute worst of circumstances. And that's when our true character comes to light, isn't it? I mean, anyone can be their best version of themselves when they are at their best, right? I think this is why I stated Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the beginning of this. Because think about it, the lower we jump on that pyramid, the more our character is tested, right? If you're going through life and you have all the things you need and most of the things you want, and really what you're trying to find is meaning, it's far easier to be a good person than it is when you have nothing, right? The more you fall down that pyramid, the more your character is tested, right? And we are who we are when hardship gets and comes towards us. That's when we see the most what our true character is. How I treat others when I'm tired, hungry, annoyed, angry is more of a measure of my character than how I treat them when I'm at my best with a full belly and a good night's sleep, right? Isn't that so true? Most of us, when we get into a social setting, we're so polite, but there's a side of us that most of us here haven't seen, isn't there? Your spouse probably has seen it, but few other people have, right? And so Ruth's character is tested in this moment, and she perseveres. She is who she is despite the worst of the worst. And Boaz takes notice, right? Ruth stands out here amongst any other gleaner for her hard work, her kindness, and her humble character. And Boaz takes notice. And we're going to see the level to which he takes notice as we continue here. So let's keep reading. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes?" Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." So Boaz addresses her as daughter. This isn't really a literal or figurative term, thinking of her as a child, but more of a term of closeness, right? He doesn't say random stranger woman. He calls her daughter, kind of drawing her in to his sphere a little bit more. And he wants her to think of him not just as a stranger, but as someone who is close and trustworthy. And he tells her not to ever go to any other field other than his, right? Something gleaners would definitely have to do because it was slim pickings. You were covering a lot of land in the course of your day to get the food you needed. And Boaz says, don't go to any other fields. Don't do that. Instead, stick close to my field, stay there, and stick to the other women, the servants that he had. He had men and women in the field gathering grain. Stay close to those women, kind of almost like you're one of them, right? And that accomplished a couple things. First off, she was safe in his field. She knew that the farmer there was allowing her to be there. But also, if you are close to the women, you'll blend in almost as one of them. And so the chance of you being messed with are already cut down way low because you just look like one of the servants that's gathering grain. A passerby might not be the wiser, right? And they would think twice before messing with a servant when there's a whole bunch of other ones around, rather than just a gleaner who's a stranger to everyone else, who's poor and destitute, and people might look the other way. And so there's already a switch and an uptick in security just from this idea of, hey, just when you're gleaning, like stick close to all my other servants who are here in the field doing their job, right? And then he tells her that he charged all the men not to touch her. Right? And so we presume before he ever goes to see Ruth, once he learns who she is, that he already went to all the men in his field and had a conversation and said, listen, she's off limits. I don't know what goes on in these fields when I'm not here, but whatever it is not going to go on with her. Like, you mess with her, you mess with me, and I'm your boss. Right? You could tell that Boaz had kind of laid down the law. Right? The everyone did what was right in their own eyes was not going to apply to Ruth while he was in charge and she was gathering in his field. Right? So he puts these layers of security and safety around her before he ever gives her anything or even sets to speak to her. She's already safer before he even says hi. Right? And finally, he tells her that when she's thirsty, she should go ahead and make use of the water that the workers have, which is not something the gleaner would do, right? You would try to stay way out of the way, right? Be not seen and not heard. And he says, no, like we have water for the people that work here. You should feel free. Like, it's hot and you're sweating, you've been working all day. Whenever you need it, just take the water. Just think of yourself as one of my own here in this field and take whatever you need when you need it, right? And here, Boaz tells her to stay close to all of the women, to partake of the water, to essentially make yourself comfortable in my field. And what we see Boaz doing here is something that goes above and beyond the call of duty of gleaning laws. He owes her nothing other than to obey those laws at a very basic level, and yet he shows her so much more kindness, right? And this naturally causes Ruth to wonder why. Like, why is this guy being so nice to me? Right? It's not normal. It's not expected. It's honestly a little concerning, maybe. Like, what's going on? And so she asks him, why are you showing me all this kindness? And Boaz answers by attesting to her character. He says, look, you are the talk of the town. Like, I know who you are, and I know what you've done. See, all the things that you've done for Naomi have been told to me, how in her level of destitution, when she was a foreigner in your land and all by herself, you wouldn't let her go home alone, but you came with her, leaving your own comfort and security to come to a land where you didn't know anybody and had no real hope of survival, yet you came. You left everything you had. And so as a result, he blesses her and he tells her that she should receive the full reward of the Lord. And he ends with this beautiful reality that she has come under the wings of the God of Israel and that he shall be her refuge. Right? And Naomi responds with gratitude because though she's not a servant, she says, she feels like she's being treated like one of his servants. And that would sound like a bad thing, right? But like that was a step up, right? For Boaz, like it's like family, friends, servants, gleaner. Like, so she's way higher on the ladder than she should be. Right? We almost see here playing out between Boaz and Ruth kind of the way that things should go when a new believer enters the presence of God's people. Right? When someone comes amongst God's people and hears about the Lord and starts to understand and surrenders their life to Christ, they're kind of a foreigner in a new land, aren't they? I have news for you. If there's non-Christians out in the town and they walked in here right now, they think all the stuff we do is really weird. Like, you kind of just every Sunday you go through church, they would find a lot of the things we do very strange, and it would be foreign to them and strange and weird. And so we see here almost this play out of the way that new believers ought to be treated as a church. This is the very basic level to which we ought to spur us towards acting towards other people, right? When folks come here, they should feel the way that Ruth feels in Boaz's field. The way I like to think of it is no one who doesn't know Jesus should ever walk through the doors of our church and not find bread and hope and belonging and security. Right? We should just work them right up that pyramid when they walk through this door. Boaz exemplifies this. And then he takes it up even more, right? As if we thought that he was done. Continue on as we read verses 14 and forward. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." And so she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied. Think of how hungry she probably was. This is not just a meal. This is like she's loading it in until she is satisfied. It's going to take a lot to satisfy a starving person. But she eats until she's satisfied. And she had some left over even. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not ever reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." And so she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay. So at mealtime, he invites her to eat, to even more be enfolded into the realm of his tribe, his people, his servants that he is providing for. He provides for her in equal measure to the workers of his field, even though she's a beggar, deserving of nothing. And he says that he doesn't just give her the food, the ration that she needs, but he gives her so much that she eats until she's satisfied, and then she has leftovers, which we're going to learn in the next set of verses, that she takes them home to Naomi, wherever she is in the city, right? She has all this stuff left over. And then he tells the workers to let her glean, to continue to let her glean as long as she wants to, but not just in the leftovers like the gleaning laws provides, but in the sheaves themselves, aka where they hadn't farmed yet, where they hadn't harvested yet. She can go anywhere in the field, completed or not. And so she doesn't have to pick the scraps. She can pick the first if she wants to. I said, wherever she goes, I don't care where she goes in my field, you do not reproach her. You don't bother her. You don't tell her no. You don't tell her she can't. You don't give her a hard time, right? And then he goes even further and he says, look, even the stuff that you guys have already harvested, like just take some out and just occasionally as you go throughout your day, like just keep giving it to her. Just keep throwing food at her, essentially, as long as she's here, right? In every way you can, make sure that she gets what she needs in this field and has the easiest time she could have doing it, right? Even though it's hard work. He sets her up and meets her basic needs. Boaz takes her from under the pyramid to above the first step of the pyramid so that her basic physiological needs, food, safety, security, are all met. He doesn't know who she's just a foreigner. She's a nobody to him, right? He does it because he knows that she is a woman of noble character and that she has cared for her mother-in-law, who is a relative of his. And so because of that, he decides that he is going to care for her. And we're told that that evening when she's done, after a long day, right, early morning to evening, essentially dawn to dusk, she works in the fields doing hard labor. And when she's done, she doesn't get to go home yet because she has to process all of the grain that she had gleaned. And we're told when she's done and processed it, and she has buckets of it, she ends up with what we're told is an ephah, which is a little more than 5 gallons worth of grain. More than enough to feed her and Naomi, and then some. Probably enough to sell some of it and perhaps find some housing and some additional security, and to have maybe a chance to climb over the second rung of the pyramid of needs, right? So in every way, at the beginning of this chapter, there's complete destitution, and by the end, they have found themselves in a place of some level of security and safety and hope. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then we continue. She goes home to find Naomi, starting in verse 19. I gotta find my place. There it is. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And Naomi said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all of my harvest,' aka you can keep coming back and gleaning every day for the rest of the season." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young woman and Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. It's the word of the Lord. Praise be to God. Finally, she returns to Naomi with not just all the grain, but all the leftover food. And Naomi, you can tell, is kind of stunned. She's like, "What are you doing with 5 gallons worth? Like, what field did you go to?" Like, you would expect to maybe come back with a 20th of that by the end of a day of gleaning. And she comes back with enough to essentially, like she did one day's job and secured 4 weeks of produce. Right? And Naomi's kind of like, "What field did you end up in?" And she said, "It was a guy named Boaz. And by the way, he said I should keep coming back. So realistically, I'll be able to probably get this much every day if I keep working hard. And he said that I should stay by women in security." And he says, "Yeah, that's one of our relatives. He's a redeemer. He's our family redeemer, one of our family redeemers." And that word is that concept's going to come into play next week when we look at Ruth 3 and how the two of them start to relate to one another more as time goes on, because Naomi's going to have some strategic ideas, right? Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match. Find me a find, catch me a catch, right? Naomi has already starting to churn. You can kind of hear it foreshadowed in this a little bit. You don't know what she's doing yet, but she said, "Yeah, it's a good idea. You should stay with those women. That's a safe place to go." And it's the most we've heard Naomi talk since she's left Moab, because there's a hope that seems to be rekindled. And so at the very first basic tier, we have this redemption of the two women through Boaz and through his faithfulness. We can clearly see how he meets not just their food needs, but their safety and security needs as well. And so the chapter begins with hopelessness and despair, but it ends on a high note. The two women are beginning to find their way. They're working their way up the pyramid, right? And when we started, Naomi and Ruth were at the bottom, and now they're up. And from the text, we see here that this thankfulness and steadfastness of Ruth and the kind, caring faithfulness of Boaz are what make it all happen. That's the surface level that we understand. Now, of course, we know that there's more and deeper things happening there, right? We know that the providence of the Lord is working its way through the two of their lives and Naomi's life as well. We know that it wasn't, there's this word, this phrase that is in Ruth that you hear all the time. If it just so happens. And it just so happens that she went to the field that day, and it just so happens that she happened upon Boaz's field, and it just so happens that Boaz was in the midst of that field on that day when normally he wouldn't be in the field in his own field. Why would he be? He has workers to do that for him. But that day he happens to be there, and it just so happens that Ruth catches his eye out in the field as he's working or talking to one of his workers, and it just so happens and just so happens. Well, we know that nothing in Ruth just so happens. God is orchestrating all of these things, but for now, until we start to see towards the end of the book the providence of God come up, for now take two things. First, character is tested and measured in hard circumstance. When things get tough for us, it is when the true measure of who we are comes to bear. Right? And Ruth ought to be an example for us of someone who remains in character in the hardest of times, right? It's worth reflecting in our own life and thinking about the times that we are at our worst. Who are we then, right? It's not enough that we act Christ-like at our best. Right now, we're here on Sunday morning. We're all dressed to the nines as well as we're going to dress, right? For the week, we show up here and we worship and we're talking to people and we're happy and hopefully we've had enough sleep and things are great. And it's really great to be Christ-like here in church with all of our brothers and sisters on Sunday morning. What about the worst of times in your home when you're looking at your spouse after they've wronged you? and you're tired, and your kids are yelling at you, right? That's where character comes out. What about when you lose a job? When your boss treats you like the dirt under his fingernails, right? Or when medical news hits that's hard. Like, character is what we're like under pressure. And Ruth shines, right? Do we? It's worth asking. Second, the measure of God's love is shown in our lives and in how we care for the least of these. Jesus drives this point over and over again. Boaz is the living example of it, but as we get to the New Testament, over and over, Jesus will tell you and drive home this idea of that which you do to the least of these is what you have done to me. And Boaz nails it when it comes to treating the least of these. Right? He takes Ruth and he elevates her overnight. Right? There are 5 rungs on that hierarchy of needs. She goes from 0 to 2 in a matter of 3 minutes. What a beautiful testament to faithfulness, to caring for those who are in need of the least of these. We ought to take that and we ought to run with it. Next week, we're going to begin to explore Ruth and Naomi's continued redemption. We're going to start to see how the relationship and the nature between Ruth and Boaz begins to change and take on a whole another meaning, and what that means not just for them, but for a whole nation, and ultimately a whole of God's people across all span and time. But for that, come back next week. Let's pray. Lord, we're thankful. We're grateful that you are faithful to us. We're grateful that you care for us as your people. And Lord, that you, in the midst of our most destitute hours, treat us like Boaz treats Ruth. That in you we can find refuge and hope and strength. Father, we pray that as we continue on this Christian life, that you would remind us of that goodness and that faithfulness, that you would keep us steadfast, and that you would allow us to be a people of noble character in the good times and in the worst of times. We thank you for the example of Ruth and Boaz. We pray that we might, through your grace and your Holy Spirit's power, live up to and into those promises. We love you and we praise you. And all His people said, amen.